welcome everyone. You can keep taking the lunch, but I'm just gonna start the proceedings for today. So, India Center, as you know, is an incubator of ideas, knowledge, research, and education on contemporary India at UCF. We institutionalized the annual India lecture series last year, and we have the third lecture of the annual India lecture series for this semester. We have with us Dr. Varun Rai. The introductions in detail will be made later. But thank you again for coming, and I look forward to an exciting discussion on energy dynamics in India. Thank you, Varun, for traveling from UT Austin. I'll now ask Laila to introduce Rananjay, Dr. Rananjay, who is going to be our moderator today. Laila, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Yogesh. It's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Varun Rai, who's going to be speaking here today. And I actually brought up Dr. Rai's introduction and not Dr. Ghos's introduction. So I will let Dr. Rananjay Ghosh, who's an associate professor in the College of Engineering and Computer Science and in the Cater Institute, do the introduction for Dr. Varun Rai. Thank you, Dr. Ghosh.
Okay, thank you, Laila. I need to use the mic, right?
It is a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Varun Rai, and I will do my introductions for him. He received his doctorate at Stanford University, and he's currently a professor at the LBJ College of Public Affairs at the University of Texas. There he directs the Energy System and Transformation Research Group, and he's part of the Mechanical Engineering Department there. His interdisciplinary research is at the interface of energy systems, behavioral science, complex systems, and public policy, and it focuses on enabling broad diffusion of sustainable energy globally. Dr. Rai has published numerous journal articles, including Applied Energy, Energy Policy, Energy Research, and Social Science, Environmental Research Letters, Global Environmental Change, Nature, Climate Change, and PLOS One. So his research has been presented in several important forums, including the United States Senate briefings, Global Economic Symposium, and Climate One at the Commonwealth Club, and has been discussed in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, and Bloomberg News, among the many other venues. He serves on the editorial boards of the Electricity Journal, the Energy Research and Social Science, for which he is also the associate editor. Dr. Rai was a Global Economic Fellow in 2009, and during 2013-15, he was the commissioner for the vertically integrated electric utility Austin Energy, about 1.4 billion revenues in 2015. In 2016, the Association for Public Policy Analysis and Management, APAM, awarded him the David N. Kershaw Award and Prize, which was established to honor persons who, under the age of 40, have made a distinguished contribution to the field of public policy, analysis, and management. Dr. Rai is the former director of the Energy Institute at the University of Texas at Austin. So it's a great pleasure. Let's welcome our speaker, Dr. Varun Rai.
Thank you so much, Rananjay, for that very kind introduction. I have many versions of this bio. This is one of the longer ones, so there are many things that I had somehow forgotten, but thank you so much for that kind introduction. I would also like to thank Yogesh and the UCF India Center for inviting me. I have had a great visit so far. Yesterday, I was at a community event, meeting with members of the community, discussing with them some of the ideas I'm going to share with you as well, but in a much more conversational fashion. And it was fascinating. I have had great meetings earlier this morning, so it's been an excellent visit. And I've enjoyed walking around the campus. Rananjay has been very, very kind. And I know it's homecoming, right? Everybody's out there. So hopefully once we're done here, we'll also all get a chance to go back to homecoming and enjoy those festivities. Right? So what I want to share with you is, just some observations of what holds for India's energy future. And in doing that, that, we want to understand a little bit of the past, how the system has evolved, what are some of the recent changes, and how does it set up India for what's to come in the future, and more importantly, what are some of the levers that India can pull to prepare itself better for its future in the world of energy. So that's what I'm going to talk about. The audience is small enough, so if you can make it very conversational, please feel free to stop me at any point in time if something is not clear or if you have a question related to that. The ideas and thoughts that I'm going to share with you are based on two recent papers that I have, both of them done last year. One of them has been published, one of them is coming as part of a book next year, both for the Stanford University's Hoover Press. The first one, on the slides there are links to both. The first one is looking at the evolution of the energy system over the last 75 years. So it's more of a historical look, but it's not a historical discussion. It's more of a synthesis of what's happened and trying to analyze and tease some common threads of what really has been driving that evolution. So I'll share some of that with you. And the second one is more of a prospective look, right? Given where we are, given where India's energy system is, where can, and for that matter, where should it go, and how can it get there? So I'm going to combine ideas from both of these papers in my thoughts. To begin with, let's take a stock of what India wants to do, what its stated goal, and that will help us understand some of the investments, some of the policy discussions, some of the issues and opportunities that are arising as part of that. So in 2021, India declared at the Conference of Parties 26, the COP26 in Glasgow, that India wants to get to net zero carbon by 2070. So that's basically on a net basis, all the carbon emissions that come out, it would somehow manage to sequester or put out an equivalent amount. So net zero doesn't mean that you will not emit anything. As we'll talk about, coal is a big part of India's energy system, and that's unlikely to go to zero anytime soon. But then there are other ways you can actually balance that by through biological sequestration, through actual sequestration underground, and all the things that you can do. So that's what net zero means. So India wants to do that. At the same time, India is still very much on an upward trajectory of development, and the primary goal for that matter is uplifting its masses toward a more prosperous state of livelihood, and energy is a big part of that, right? If you look at the history of any society, any community, it's really been how communities and societies use and work with energy for productive means to be more productive and have good, enjoyable, healthy, livelihoods. So India wants to do that, and balancing these two is really the arc of the future that we want to try to understand. But that arc can only be achieved given where India stands. So that's kind of some of the dynamic we want to explore a little bit. One of the things that I've been thinking a lot about, there just so many ideas and solutions. You want to go to net zero? Sure, do this. You want to connect people and serve them with energy? Sure, invest more, do this. We all know at the same time too that there are so many demands on the resources. Why just do energy and not focus that on health, or not focus that on the education of children, right? There's just so many issues. Even in energy, there are just so many ideas. There are many demands on the very limited resources, and the question then becomes, what should we focus on? And that's kind of the kind of pivot I want to make, and I have made in the arguments I make in these papers. An important principle that I lay out is to recognize the impossibility of pushing and succeeding on all of these frontiers. I will basically say, okay, these are all great ideas, many of which I'll discuss in the coming slides, but you also have to recognize that not all of it can be achieved simultaneously, right? So it's no point pushing everything and trying to be the leader in everything. Let's recognize from the get-go, that there are only a few things that are impactful, meaningful, and that India can really lead its way out of there. So the basic idea there is that leading of everything doesn't matter. It's really leading on the frontiers that matter. So I want to share with you what I think some of those frontiers are. So the next few slides are just kind of giving you a lay of the land. It's important to understand what India's energy landscape is before we talk about opportunities and issues. So what you're looking at here is the energy consumption by different countries over the years, over the last roughly 50 or so years. And of course, the big change that you see here is, of course, China is the biggest consumer of energy, and it's just been extremely rapid in the last 25 years, and that's a story that we all have heard of or know of. The US has been a big user ever since, for a long time. For a long time, it was the largest consumer, and now it has fallen flat and is second now, almost half of China. This is changing though, something I'm not going to discuss, but I'll just point out, this is changing rapidly. One of the things that is happening is there's a lot of AI-driven data center growth, and that is not small. That is projected under certain scenarios to be very, very big and strong, so this could kind of tick up. It's unlikely to catch up to China anytime soon. And then, of course, the other story has been that of India's, and that story started also around the same time as China's, about 20-25 years ago, where India's consumption has really grown by a very significant amount, but still, it's much smaller, but still third at the country level in the whole world. So it's a very large consumer. Something I would like to point out is standing in 95, even 2000, it was not apparent that India will actually manage this, right? There are all sorts of questions of governance, questions of policies, questions of finance, questions of management, questions of resource, where there are many trajectories and many scenarios under which it was quite possible, and some of those stories have actually played out in other countries and other contexts, that India will actually remain flat or may not be able to do much. So one of the things, the first thing I would like to just point out as a matter of fact is there are many things that India actually has gotten right, or at least in the right direction, that has enabled this growth. This was not given, okay? Especially in the very diverse and the democratic setting that India is in, as compared to China, where there's a much more direct control of how investments and decisions get made. So that's something that is important to note and not negligible. So while India's overall energy consumption is very large, its per capita consumption is still quite small. I mean, you see there's a long line of countries that are ahead of India in terms of per capita consumption. For that matter, comparing with the two countries that consume at the country level more than India, India is 1/10 of the US. Per capita, US has a lot of energy usage, and 1/5 of China, right? So it's, and why is that? Well, India is a very populous country, right? 1.4 billion plus people, and that means that a lot of the population that lives in rural India that has a very different nature in the way it uses its energy. So this is just a partial picture of that energy usage, but what you're looking at is in cooking. So the orange dots are rural areas, and the blue triangles are urban areas. And what you're seeing is in cooking, what is the share of biomass versus share of LPG and coal. This actually combines, this axis combines both LPG and coal. And what you're seeing is most of the rural India, where still most of the population is, roughly 2/3 of the population is still there, are still using biomass, mostly wood and cow dung and those types of resources. And then on the lighting side, it's a similar story, right? And here the fuel sources are kerosene and including some biomass also. And then share of electricity increases only in the urban area. So there is a separation, if you will, in rural India versus urban India, even today, in terms of what really fuels cooking, lighting, and other uses of energy. And that is an important driver of why capita energy consumption of India is still on the lower side, actually, still on the very low side, if you will. This is an important slide, and I'm not sure what the color distinctions are apparent, but at least that these bars are apparent. And I'll take a few minutes actually to go through this. This really, in many ways, if I could do the whole talk in one slide, I can actually do the whole talk using this slide. There's just so much in here. What you're looking at is where does India's energy come from, and where does it go to within India? Okay. So the first thing is, and so that's what the bar. So this says this much of India's energy from among all sources comes from domestically produced coal, right? And then there's some imported coal, and these two together lead to all the coal that India uses. So that's how to understand this chart. So the first thing I want to talk about is coal, and coal is, as you can see, it is the predominant source of all forms of energy that is used in India, and it mostly is produced domestically, and that's a very, very important thing. Oftentimes when we think about coal as a polluting resource, it has lots of local pollution, it has lots of CO2 emissions, which is a global pollution, right? And the straightforward solution that is proposed is, hey, let's just stop using coal, replace it with some other resources, and so on and so forth. Those are well-meant suggestions, but they fail to understand the underlying history and resource base and the technology base that India has developed. So, as I will emphasize later, as you can see, coal is the only energy natural resource that India really has invested in, right? In the world where energy is increasingly and has always been and increasingly being used as a political weapon for any country, no matter what its resource base is, that resource base becomes very important and very dear. That's something very important to keep in mind. It's not simple or easy matter of just economics or any other dimension to drive that. It is what you have, it is what you can hopefully control and steer in ways that are in your own interest. So the same thing with China, same thing with oil and natural gas in this country, right? It's very important, we have it, and what can we do? We want to do it in a good way, we want to do it in a responsible way, but just the sheer thought of taking it away and curbing it away, I think it's very simplistic, right? So I think it's a very important piece of the story. So that's half of the story. The other half of the coal story in India is the technology. Coal is also the only resource, just because it's just so important and so much there in India, where India has actually developed homegrown technologies where the whole supply chain of technology is in India. It doesn't have to import or depend on, for the majority of it doesn't really have to depend on imported technologies to supply its coal-based power plant generation. That's also very important. Increasingly, we are in a world where technology exports are also being used as a lever for geopolitical purposes, right? And so, if you have a resource base, if you have the technology base, it gives you at least some confidence on your trajectory, and it matters a lot. It matters a lot to the countries. It matters a lot to the policymakers to have that type of at least some sense of control for some part of the economy, some part of the resource base. So I think it's very important to keep where India is coming from on its coal base. The same story you can talk about China in different ways, but very similar. And the same story here in the US for oil and gas, and also coal up until recently. Coal is on a decided decline in the US, but not because we are phasing coal out of it for environmental reasons. It's just natural gas is just so competitive. The coal has no economic future here. Hasn't had one for the last decade or so. All right, so that's coal. The other thing I want to point out is, see, all of this is coal. Coal is coming in. It's combining to become part of the electricity generation. A part of it is not shown here. That part of this goes for heat purposes, for steel making, and so on. Those are details, and we just want to leave that out. And the electricity part is here, but you see, about 2/3 of the energy in coal is wasted as wasted heat. And these are thermal losses. This is a very, very thermal-mechanical process, right? Really a thermal process. And so you just can't capture. These are governed by first law, but especially second law of thermodynamics, and there's only so much of that energy that you can harness for useful purposes. So what it basically says, you input 100 units, and what you really get out for electricity is like 30 units, basically. Yeah, and so that's important to keep in mind. So if you need to produce and serve a certain use, you need to produce a lot more coal. That's the message. So it can be very inefficient. More recently, there's a growing pie, especially on renewables. So this is solar and wind. India has had nuclear and hydro. Those were mostly built in the 70s and the 80s and kind of have stayed almost where they are. They really haven't grown very fast, even though nuclear is growing, and we can talk about that if there is a topic of interest. But it's really the renewables, which still, compared to coal, as you can see, it's a very small sliver of the electricity that is being produced, but it's a big piece, right? And roughly at this point in time, roughly 20% or so of electricity generation in India is coming from renewables, right? Solar, wind, if you add nuclear and hydro, all of these combined are providing about 30% of electricity in India, which is very significant, especially for a country of this size of consumption. So that's the second part, and we'll talk a little bit more about renewables in particular. What's very interesting about renewables in India is the geography of the resource, right? And I'll get to that. I don't want to jump that point, but that's a very big point when you want to understand the social and the political dynamics of what drives some of these changes and what it means for the country itself. So we'll get there in a second. And then the third piece, another very important piece, is the oil and gas piece, in particular the oil piece. So first, right off the bat, I'll say India uses some gas, natural gas, mostly for industrial purposes, not for power generation. So these are chemicals manufacturing. These are, these are for fertilizer manufacturing and so on. And a lot of that is imported. So India, you see it's imported LNG. It produces some and it imports some, roughly 50-50. India hasn't had much luck with natural gas production, and there were times, especially about 20 years ago, when there was a lot of hope and excitement, and those didn't materialize. India tried a lot. Okay, so the underlying undertone here is that India has been, in general, unlucky with its natural resource endowment, right? And so that hasn't helped its story. That hasn't helped, its homegrown production of these resources, which would lead to a different story. And that has meant many things, which we'll get to. But I want to come to the oil piece because it's very important. As you can see, much of the oil used in India is actually imported, right? The domestic crude is about 20%, around 80% of what is needed and consumed in India is imported, all right? And all of that is refined, and then a lot of that goes into transportation and then other uses as well. Some of it is exported as well. So India imports some petroleum products. Then also, there are some export-oriented refineries. Some of them have been in the news more recently because of the Russian imports. We can get there if you want to in Q&A. But it's interesting. It's a very complex thing. It's not as if everything you refine, you are selling it in the domestic market. No, there are parts of it that you export, and then there are parts of it that you import. The same thing, right? And why do you do that? Well, there are different investors who invest and build infrastructure, not necessarily for one market, for other markets, and those loans and those finances and infrastructure are oriented that way. And the other piece that can contribute to this is the domestic logistics, right? If you're producing something on the West Coast, it might be easier to just ship it to Europe than shipping it through India, through rail lines, which are just bottlenecked and so on. Lots of things that can drive this. So this basically sets up the story, which is coal is very important for its resource and the technology that India has developed. Renewables are the new growth story, which are really very promising and still at an early stage, but growing very rapidly, in particular solar. So the yellow part here is solar. And then, oil is a story where India has tried a lot, and I'll come to this point a little bit later, but it still finds itself in this position of importing most of it. Okay, I'm going to keep going, but let me pause here for a second, both to grab a sip of water, but then also see if you all have any questions you want to ask. Yes, please.
You mentioned the social, and I'm kind of reading this into how you were describing it, correct me if I'm wrong, the emotional connection between coal and the Indian national identity. Do you think that would impede changes in the share of energy here over time? Like in 30 years, do you expect renewables, nuclear and hydro, to make up a larger proportion of this, or is coal going to still be dominant?
That's an excellent question. I think that direction is going in one direction, which is more solar, more wind, more diversification, not necessarily away from coal, but solar and wind have become quite cheap. If India can get its hand on more natural gas through domestic production or imports from the US, it's good. It's not good for any country, and India knows this, China knows this, US knows this, to really bank on one resource for majority of it. Yeah, you could run out of it, or for some reason there are bottlenecks in the supply chain which hits just one type of resource, then much of your system is crippled, right? And so there are other reasons. So the reasons of economics, but coal is, it's not only about CO2. Coal can also have, it has lots of local pollution, SOx and NOx, right? These are things that can really
Health consequences.
totally, right? Health consequences, and often they are visible, right? So when you are in these places, we went through this history in this country. China has gone through this, still going through it. India is going through it. You just the air that you breathe, but not just breathe, the air that you see and walk through is visibly different and not clean, and this. And as a country grows and as people get more educated and more informed, this is not something anybody wants to live through, right? So these are very tough trade-offs. It's also not easy to say let's shut off coal. No. So but given where we are because of environmental reasons, but especially because of economics and supply chain diversity issues, you're seeing the trajectory. I don't think India is going to build a lot more hydro. Hydro is, it's great, but it has its own set of issues. Water flows, are changing because of climate change, and also building these can becoming increasingly environmentally challenging, and so you can always. But the thing to keep in mind is how big is the country and how big its demand is, and everything is going to be important, and everything is going to play a small role, and that is what continues to make coal very important. It is already there, it is already big. It's unlikely India will grow it a lot more, but even from where it is, 70% of a large system, even if you don't build it, will only go down to 40% or 50% in 30 years or 50 years. So it's still going to be very important. It's not going to go away, and that's one of the things I actually write in these papers, where there is a misinformed sense, even in sometimes in the scholarly community, to just say, hey, let's just put carbon capture and storage. Something I was planning to come on later, but I think this is a good point to just point that out. And carbon capture and storage would be all the emissions that you are emitting from the coal plants. You put in big contraptions, so this is almost machinery as big as the power plant itself. They will capture the CO2, clean the flue gas, right? And then only emit the cleaned gas, and then take the CO2 that you captured through a lot of chemical and thermal processes. That's why the machinery is so big. And then you put the CO2 underground, or make some other productive uses, which are hard to come by, but normally you put them underground for long-term storage. For the scale and the geology and the economics and the social conditions for both China and India, but certainly in India, that's a pipe dream.
It's costly.
It's very costly because I already showed you 65 to 70% of the coal generation is lost as heat. If you have to capture the carbon, you're going to lose 30% more of whatever is remaining. Not 30%, that would be like 100% loss. But you're left with 30%. you will lose 30% of the 30%. You will lose 10% more. So what does that mean? It means you have to produce more coal, you have to use more water, you have to use more logistics, X, Y, Z, and it just it's very nice on paper. It just doesn't scale up. And so, but what does that mean? It means, sure, so India is going to keep emitting through coal, and what does it mean? And where is its responsibility? I have some ideas about that. So it's not to say that, hey, because it can't do it and it's very expensive, let's give it a free pass. No, that's not the point. The point is, first recognize what it can or cannot do, what is impossible, and so let's not spend any time and resource doing that. Can we think about and push on alternative frontiers which are more reasonable, but then also they provide a solution that is more holistic, which is what I want to get to.
Yeah, I want to add a few points to your views that yes, that's the vision. By 2030 we need to have a clean coal energy. It's one of the India's initiative. That's the reason many CSIR labs, they are involved in R&D projects related to coal, where they want to remove the products that cause the pollution. So clean coal energy is one of the initiative by Indian government. They do a kind of R&D works on coal gasification, and I know because I have been there in the lab, CSIR, Indian Institute of Chemical Technology, where they have a setup where they were collecting coal samples and they were testing those coal samples in their lab just to see how they can add or make some contribution to this clean coal energy initiative.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for adding that. And I'll come to this point of R&D and innovation that is just so central to this whole story. In fact, that's the eventual solution to a lot of the issues, but that's also the way to capture a lot of the opportunities. Something where there is a lot of opportunity for India. And I think India could have, but certainly should do a lot more on that frontier. So yes, definitely there is very interesting work going on in this space. All right, other questions? And I'll just move on, and please feel free to stop. Okay, so the final point on this chart is, very interestingly, just in the matter of last 5 or so years, the US has become a large exporter to India on all 3 major frontiers. Oil, LNG, and even coal, right? So we are using less here, but some of that is finding its way out to Europe and certainly also to India. So the US is one of the top 3 suppliers in each of these to India. So I find that quite interesting. So let's break this down. So this was kind of the larger picture. I want to break some of this down to give you a little bit more nuances. This is electricity generation capacity in India for the last 45 years or so. It ends in 2020. There are a couple of things that are important to note here. For a long time, this was all centrally organized, which is federal government and some state governments basically trying to manage the generation and build the generation and so on, and own all of it and operate all of it and so on. So that's this orange bar up until 2005 roughly. And then there are a whole series of policies and regulations that were initiated. This had built up, right? When the country is growing or wants to grow a lot, and there's mismanagement, there's a lot of hope, but you're not able to supply, different forces really come into play, and that basically unlock and enable a lot of policy action. That is what happened. We saw that late 90s and early 2000s, and that basically opened up private participation, right? So opened up the sector for competition, and allowed and created both the framework but also the policy clarity for the private sector to come into play. So what did the private sector do? First, build a lot of coal. Okay, so this was the story from 2005 to 2015, where coal blocks were auctioned, and many private companies won those auctions and were producing coal. So coal production moved out to private for the first time. And then they were putting coal power plants, often very close to the mine. So these were, captive mines, if you will. Captive in the sense, produced coal goes into the power plant. They're co-located almost. And many of them were also buying stakes in Indonesia and Australia in coal mines. buying stakes in shipping companies and bringing that to their party. This was a big time, huge time from a regulation, policy, and finance infrastructure competition. This was a redefining era for India, very important. That was extremely central to the first chart I showed you, where India had this growth. While it is lower than China and the US, it still had a very substantial growth. That would not have been possible. It was necessary because the people would still be there. It would still be a country of 1.4 billion, but the per capita that you're seeing, that 7,000 kilowatt hours, that would probably be only 3,000 kilowatt hours or 4,000 kilowatt, half of what it is. It is not that because the private sector came in. It was allowed to come in, not that it came in. It was allowed to come in, and they were very, very creative in building it. That's why competition matters. That's why not doing everything in the state setting is a good idea. That happened up until 2015, and then there are many different lessons learned and many different drivers, including that the price of solar and wind started coming. There was a lot more focus on, hey, why is India building so much coal? And by the way, why are all these big global companies building a lot of coal in India? Because these big companies are international companies. They are engaged in all markets, and there is a movement going on across the world. Hey, we need to focus on emissions. We need to reduce CO2 emissions, and so these big companies are exposed to all these markets, all these discussions and criticisms, and so on and so forth. So that the environmental responsibility and leadership combined with the economics of renewable energy, solar and wind, rapidly coming. So just between these same years, in fact on a much smaller time scale, between 2005 to 2020, price of solar went down by 80 to 90%. Just completely crazy how fast prices have come down. That, and then the third piece was, as the private sector built more coal, it found that building even more coal was getting harder in India, right? Because you can generate this, but you have to sell it to the utility, right? This electricity, private companies, are not, from majority of India, they're not the distributors. The distributors are still state-owned companies, and in this case, the state doesn't mean government, it's the state governments that actually. So for example, it would be like, Florida distribution is owned by the government of Florida, which is not the case, but it's akin. If that was the case, that is what actually happens in India. And a lot of these state-owned distribution companies, these are called discoms, they are in very bad financial health. Because historically, electricity has been subsidized in India for political reasons, for social reasons, and that means that these are loss-making entities, right? You keep the prices low so that people can use and consume, and that creates this feedback loop of expectation that prices will stay, and so it's just very hard to raise prices because whosoever does it is going to pay hugely in political setting, and so it means that you are, as a private generator, you are selling into that setting, and that setting, the entity is financially so weak, in fact it's bankrupt if it was not propped up all the time by the central and the state government. And so you can build some of it, and they build a lot of it, but building more of it was coming with more and more financial risk. You're not going to get paid. And so this is known in the financial community, and what it means is the next time you go build a power plant, you need money, right, to build that, and where the money comes from, it comes from banks. And the banks know that you're at increased risk of not getting paid back, so it will charge you instead of 5% or 6%, they charge you a 10% or 15% interest rate, which just makes it even more uneconomical compared to solar and wind. These three factors, the environmental responsibility leadership, price of economics of solar and wind, and the increasing difficulty of building more of this and hoping to get paid back, led to the private sector actually transitioning into building a lot more solar and wind in India. So that's kind of what's been going on here. India is still building some coal and some nuclear, but all of the coal that is being built in India is being built by the government, and all the nuclear plant that's being built in India is also being built by the government at this point in time. Okay? Let's see, let's do a time check. Excellent. So I'm gonna basically say that in the papers I make this point, and this is one of the main contributions of the papers, is like take the entire history. There's a lot more history. I take all of that to basically point out that over the last 75 years, India has had these 5 major imbalances in its energy system, which have been shaping its actions, if you will. So you can use the lens of these 5 imbalances to almost make sense of all the actions that have happened in the past or that might actually happen moving forward. And the pivot I make is anything that we think of a good productive solution going forward has to keep these 5 imbalances in mind. If you're coming up with a solution that is divorced from these 5 imbalances or not connected to understanding and speaking or harnessing these 5 imbalances, it's not a well-designed idea or thought. It's unlikely to survive, right? So if you want things to have lasting value, my proposition is that you have to pay careful attention to the 5 imbalances. What are those imbalances? The central versus state politics and authority. So in India is a federal system. There's a central, very much like here, right? There's a central government and there are state governments, and they have jurisdictions to do things differently. In energy, often, and in particular in electricity, it's split. Some of this is with the center, some of it is with the state, and who is at center is often not the same as who is in state. Here we only have but we have a 2-party system, so that separation is not as much. In India we have many parties, and so this separation can be much more stark and much more diverse, and so the ensuing politics can be much harder, if you will. I'm not going to go into much more detail of that. But the point that some of this I'll go into a little bit more detail. So that's on that. I'll go into a bit of detail on this, a bit more on this. Urban-rural, I already pointed out a little bit, just to keep in mind any solution. What I'm saying is any solution you do, you have to look at the urban-rural dimension, right? How does that solution, if you want to do carbon capture and storage, sure, what does it mean for that urban-rural divide, right? What does it mean for growth and social mobility? So what I'm going to do is actually tell you a little bit more on these other 3 dimensions. The first one I already mentioned. It's not just the resource, it's not just the coal or solar. It becomes very important where that resource is in India. So there's a lot on this. Let me explain to you what you're seeing. The underlying colors, right? That's the color of consumption, right? So where is India consuming most of its electricity? The darker it is, the more the consumption is, right? So here you have Uttar Pradesh, which is consuming a lot. And why is it consuming a lot? Because it is the most populous state in India. Its population is almost the size population of the US. More actually, right? And so just the sheer number of people it leads to lots of consumption. On the west, you have Gujarat and Maharashtra as the big consumers, but for a different reason. So Maharashtra is very populated, but these are also highly industrialized states. So the consumption really is high in these states, less because of population, unlike UP, but more because of the industrial uses of electricity. So that's the consumption. What you also see is generation. Those are the pies for each state. There is a stark difference. Look on the eastern side, eastern central side, mostly black, or dark, which is coal. So all the coal generation is on the eastern part, right? I don't have the time to go through this history, but if you want to understand the social aspects of not just of energy, just general social aspects and interaction between society and government and jobs and livelihoods, coal will tell you much of the story, right? These are centrally owned, these are government-owned companies. There's a lot of employment, but not just employment. The entire ecosystem of who is supplying what, everything, hospitals, roads, everything is tied to this. A lot of it is tied to this. So that's kind of the story of coal. So it becomes important. So the important point is, if you want to do away with coal, you want to do away with the entire social fabric here. Deal with that. So again, I gave you other reasons of why doing away with coal is hard, because India has the resource, India has the technology, it has the need. I think this is a even harder reason of why you just can't do away with coal. It just doesn't work that way. On the other side, look at some of the western states, southern states. A lot of solar. Most of the solar is here and here, right? And so all the new energy is coming there for two reasons. One is, that is where the resource is. These are the windy states. You don't have much wind here, but these are windy states. These are the sunny states. So that's one. And the second, these states, several of them also have more progressive policy and regulatory settings. So they enable the investment to basically come in, right? So this becomes very important in understanding, well, this is logged into an older resource base and an older institutional setting. Here, these are also the economically better situated states which are using the new investments and new energy. And then eventually, if you have to do away with coal, you have to supply from here to here, which means money will need to flow from here to there, worsening the situation, right? So the geography has a lot of difficulties associated with what can or cannot change over meaningful periods of 20 to 30 years, right? So that's why some of these timelines in India are now going to be pushed off a little bit. I want to speed up a little bit in the interest of time. We have talked about energy security. This basically makes the point again that this is India's oil consumption over the years, and this is what it produces domestically. It has tried a lot, and I wrote a big chapter on this back in 2010, going through the entire history, but then also why it is so flat. All right, so go into the details of the ONGC, Oil and Natural Gas Corporation, its governance, its incentives, and so on and so forth. It's a fascinating story, but the main point I want to make is, at the end of the day, India imports about 80% of it, and at this point in time, so throughout, India has viewed this oil and gas, and especially oil, through the energy security lens. But for a long time, up until 5-10 years ago, India really believed and hoped that it can find the resources within India, and now that's gone, right? So India has become much more sanguine on this frontier, saying, hey, we'll keep trying, but unlikely we'll find it and be able to supply this demand. So that means India has become a lot more engaged and responsible customer of these resources globally. It has other implications, but that is to move on to point out that even what India has thought of energy security as, even that construct, that notion has changed, right? In the very beginning, it was, when India got independence, it was affordability. Can we supply cheap energy? That is why we are in the system where we supply cheap energy to our masses, and they get a little bit, all of them, but we can't supply them more because it's a vicious circle, right? We keep prices low and people expect low prices, so we can't pay for more generation, and so we can't supply more. But anyway, that's where it started. And then can we produce more energy at home? So that's self-reliant supply security to financial sustainability. So these are the years of the 90s, when India had the financial crisis, the foreign exchange crises, and then India really set up those policy and regulatory changes leading into those eras where I said private competition and setting up the regulation, that's market design. And then more recently, it's about diversification of supply. Doesn't matter where it's, what fuel it is, doesn't matter which country it is coming from. Let's just make sure we have it. We don't have to only look for these things produced domestically. And that's an important shift, because that was not the mindset 5-10 years ago. This is the central story. I'll set it up now, and I'll actually end back on this one. This is about the technological capabilities. So throughout this 75-year period, where there have been waves of use of coal, oil, nuclear, hydro, natural gas, then back to coal, this is the 80s. This is, I'm talking globally, right? And then more recently, wind and solar. India has tried to follow and ride some of those waves without necessarily having the technologies, right? Sure, natural gas looks very attractive. Where are we going to get the turbines from? You go buy it on the international market. By companies who have those turbines, right? If you want to do wind and solar, where do you get the panels from? Well, you go and buy it from China. India doesn't have. It has some, and it has tried to incentivize and so on and so forth. But the point I'm trying to make is, in general, you have to be on the market, no matter what resource it is, you have to be on the market to buy these technologies. And in general, across all of these ways, India has lacked world-class technological capability to really build the technologies and supply chain on its own, and has had to buy a lot of these technologies. And so throughout the years, India has been scrambling on all frontiers, be it using bilateral national partnerships with many different countries, depending on what technology it is, government-owned production, funding R&D, we heard about that, also trying to incentivize foreign direct investment because some of that also comes with technology. But it's been a constant scramble to basically catch up to the next wave, just because the technology ecosystem is not there, or it arrives a little bit too late, like India is trying to do in solar now. I think it's too late to build the types of technology that China is doing. There's still an argument to say, hey, at least we can have some part of the supply chain, sure, right? But that's not the same thing as really building very, very fast. I'm gonna skip the details on this slide and just say that these are basically investments and number of patents by Indian startups in low carbon energy technologies, and it's not a rosy picture, right? So there's activity, but given the size and need of India, this is not very strong, and that it just speaks to the same point that there is a lot of both need and opportunity for India to do more. It is doing, but this is the point where India can really do a lot more. There, in the papers, I lay out many different ideas. I don't have the time to go through all of them, but I just point three things which I think are going to be very important for India. One of them is thinking directly about the rural-urban divide, and we have another paper that talks about these decentralized renewable energy assisted machines. So these are small-scale machines using solar and storage. So these can be, for example, roti rolling machines. This can be sewing machines. This can be solar-powered air blowers for ironsmiths or blacksmiths. Lots of them. This is all real, right? This is not hope, but these are actual rural entrepreneurs that are using these technologies. And the important thing about this is that you can not only use solar and storage to do this, but you actually connect the usage with livelihood. So they generate income to be able to pay for the machinery and pay for the usage. Historically, what's been done is let's connect a village, and that's it. That's where the story ends. Where are the villagers going to pay for the electricity, right? And so it's not connected directly. And so you can do this, and there are other ideas of how, if you do this, you can connect it back across all the rural areas and close up the divide. Carbon markets. These are basically you want to reduce emissions. To create markets, and we have known about these, and there are many challenges in doing that. The point with India is that India historically has done carbon markets mostly to speak to international needs, right? And my argument is that India should really change that perspective and look inside and develop these markets in a very transparent fashion, in a very viable fashion, in an integrated fashion for its own uses, and not necessarily to supply the needs of other countries who want to reduce their emissions. And they have other ideas in the papers as to why that matters. But the bigger point is, it's not about if you do a wind or solar farm in India, it's going to count towards emissions reductions in country Y in EU. Rather, how can you integrate within its own plans? And this serves as a counterbalance to India's continued coal-based emissions, right? And then the last thing I point out before concluding is there are many technologies, including, for example, green hydrogen. And here what you do is you take water and you use solar or wind energy to split the water into hydrogen and oxygen, and you take that hydrogen, and that hydrogen becomes the fuel then. You can burn it in turbines, you can use it directly in chemical processes, you can do lots of things with the hydrogen, right? It is expensive. And it is a technology or a value chain where no country, for that matter, has really come out as a winner, saying, hey, it's pointless. So there is no China in green hydrogen, for that matter, right? So this is still an open space. There are many reasons for which I really think this is a good idea. If you only look at this may not be a great idea, but there are reasons that I lay out reasons that have to do with the east-west divide in India, the rural-urban divide in India, the infrastructure trajectory in India, why this can lead to a very integrated solution. So I'm quite optimistic about green hydrogen's future in India, but really it's a point about India needs to think not about what people are saying today, this is very expensive and so on. Well, that's always the case. My point is if India doesn't spend on this, 20 or 30 years down the road, it's going to be in the same position. Okay, now let's buy green hydrogen technologies from the international market. So it doesn't want to do that. I'll summarize very quickly. I'm not going to spend any time on this. All I will say is India has come a very long way, really a very long way. But where the problems and opportunities of yesterday are not the problems and opportunities of tomorrow. So India has to take a different position. It has. There are really good markers. The one thing that it really needs to change and transform is its innovation ecosystem. Right? This is this goes whether you want to reduce carbon emissions, whether you want to do green hydrogen, whether you want to one of the points was resource reuse. A lot of these materials that go into batteries and solar, they have to be dumped at some point. There's only so much of that. How can you reuse and recycle more of that material? This is also where there is no China, right? I mean, everybody is doing something, but there is no country that has arrived with those set of technologies, and it's pointless for others. No, this is also one of those areas where India can. So there are many open questions in innovation, and India really should completely transform the scale at which it does things. And I'll end there, and I'm happy to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for this informative talk. I'm very happy to take some questions for the speaker. Please raise your hand. Yes, please.
I did have one from a few slides back. We don't need to change the slide now. You drew an interesting picture showing the timeline, the difference in development when the state in India controlled coal production as opposed to when it liberalized, opened up the market. I just had a question about because it's not broken down here, it's not the purpose of the diagram. The proportion of foreign investment that you mentioned earlier as opposed to domestic investment in coal production in the private industry. How much of domestic coal production do the people of India actually have control over as opposed to foreign companies that just produce in India?
Yeah, most of it is Indian produced and Indian controlled, majority of it.
Any other question? All right, okay.
Yeah, I'll just be okay.
Well, just get it so it'll record on the.
Oh.
If you use the mic.
Okay.
Then.
Hi, thanks Varun. Excellent presentation. I really like looking at it historically, right? And those 5 phases you talked about, it's like a historian's analytical gaze at looking at these things. So really enjoyed and learned a lot. Could you speak a bit more about the nuclear? Because that has always been a promised land which Indian energy ecosystem has never reached. But with technological promises today, which we see also kind of reflecting in India's policy, right? Both the nuclear liability law as well as the Atomic Energy Act, it appears is under discussion to be changed. So if you could reflect on that, that would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, totally. That's a great and very timely question. Nuclear, for that matter, is going through a very exciting phase worldwide, right? I mean, in this country, there is expected faster growth of electricity, and where are you going to get that from? In particular, given the nature of the demand, so nuclear has a space for that. It's coming up. India, for a long time, the last 50 years or so, has been very excited about nuclear. Currently, there are about a little over 8 gigawatts. That's like 8 large. There are 24 reactors, but you can think of them as 8 large modern power plants, a gigawatt each roughly. That's not the case in India. I'm just giving you